he got away with murder, and if I ever fought back, I got in trouble. It was pretty clear my parents favored him. He got most of everything unless someone called them out on it. Eventually, we moved 150 miles away from nosy relatives who'd only see us on holidays, which the parents liked because they were all about putting on appearances. My brother, meanwhile, was a terror. He got physical with me sometimes, made moves on my first girlfriend till she dumped me, and always laughed at my bad luck. My parents told me to suck it up whenever I complained. But the charade ended with holidays, where they had to treat us equally for show. I still remember their faces when they had to play fair during birthdays and Christmas because of gossipy relatives. Things got even more awkward when I turned 18 and left home mid-high school, no less. I'd had enough, even if couch surfing was the only alternative. It was better than living with them. From then on, I kept my distance. Didn't even see them at my high school graduation, and wasn't bothered by it. I usually only saw my family during holidays like everyone else. Then 2020 hit, and everything went south. The pandemic cost me my job, and my roommate and I couldn't afford our condo anymore. We both lost our jobs, so I had to sell almost everything just to downsize and avoid being homeless. I loved that condo, but I was living too large for my own good. Lesson learned. I should have saved more for a rainy day. But I had a plan. I love trucks and had one, so I bought a $1,000 camper in good shape and slapped it on my truck. The idea was to crash there temporarily, but it turned into a longer stay than I thought. I hoped to park at my parents' place, where my brother and his family still lived, but my parents said no. They didn't want me there, and our rocky past didn't help. They'd let me park if I paid the same as renting an apartment, but that was way too much. I was saving every penny of my unemployment to find a new job and couldn't swing that. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to scram, and my sister-in-law found it hilarious that I was living in a camper. My brother joined in, calling me a homeless bum. I spent the first night in a store parking lot, scared out of my wits that someone might break in. I didn't sleep well and had nowhere else to go. Other relatives were far away, and my apartment-dwelling friends couldn't help. I didn't want to leave my area, so I had my mail sent to a friend's place to stay on top of things. Finding a stable place to park was tough, and job hunting was a pain. I bounced around, trying to find work similar to my old gig. I lived the nomadic camper life for months, dealt with everything from beggars to drug addicts, and people telling me to move because of my eyesore camper. One guy claimed the HOA wanted me gone, even though there were no houses nearby, and got belligerent when I questioned it. I moved to avoid trouble. For power, I used a long extension cord to plug into random outlets to keep my camper batteries charged. I know it wasn't the best move, but I needed power for my fridge, and my small solar power bank was only good for charging my phone. Generators were too costly and noisy. After a few months, I finally got a new job in a neighboring city that wasn't retail. I'd sworn off retail after college, but was this close to breaking that vow. Even though I was still getting unemployment, I was itching to work again and needed stability before it ran out. I was so bored living in that camper. Apart from job hunting, all I did was read, watch movies on a tiny DVD player, and use my phone or laptop. I'd mapped out where I could park and which public bathrooms I could use. Man, I wished we had public bathhouses like in Japan. When I did get hired, I practically lived in the lot behind the company building, in unused employee parking spaces so far back they were almost forgotten. The boss liked it because I was always around to take extra shifts. So, as long as I got enough sleep, my boss didn't mind at all. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spots so I could cruise around without it. Not entirely sure if that was by the book, but no one bugged us about it the whole time I was living back there. I didn't deal with many trespassers, just a few, but the security guards always took care of them. I was basically on call almost all the time and worked nearly every day. My boss let me hook up my camper to the building's power and water, and I paid a bit of rent by working for free on Sundays when it was just me, the janitor, and the security guard in the office. For showers, I had to rely on a friend's place or my local gym because the camper didn't have one, just a portable toilet I didn't want to bother emptying. Gross job. But I could use the warehouse bathroom anytime I needed. I got to know the night security guard pretty well. He's become one of my closest friends. In the winter, the camper heated up easily with a little electric heater, but summers were a drag. No AC meant I had to dig up a used portable air conditioner to survive. I clocked a lot of overtime and picked up new skills from coworkers along the way. By the middle of this year, I landed a supervisor gig at the company that paid better than my old job. That's when I decided I needed a house. Losing my condo gave me a wake-up call for something more stable. I found this 3-bedroom manufactured home just a couple miles from work and snagged it for $10,000 less than the asking price. It drained my savings for the down payment, but I got the home loan I needed. Finally, didn't have to live in the camper. I parked my truck in the backyard and set up the camper out there just in case I ever needed it again. Once I was settled in, I foolishly bragged a bit on Facebook. That's when things got crazy. A few weeks later, my parents and my brother's family showed up without warning, looking for a tour of my new digs. I never even gave them my address, so how they found me, I'll never know. None of my friends confessed to spilling the beans, and no family visited before, so maybe they stalked me at work. Wouldn't shock me. As soon as I opened the door, they barged in like excited kids on a field trip, poking around everywhere. My sister-in-law had this weird smile she kept flashing me, and later on, I found out why, which set me off big time. My parents kept yakking about how I had way too much space for someone without a wife or kids. I mean, not yet, but maybe someday. My brother kept noting how my place was bigger than our parents and closer to his job. Total red flags. Eventually, my brother, let's call him Dan, wanted a private chat. Everyone else conveniently stepped outside, and it hit me they had a plan. Dan said my house was too much for just me and suggested he move in with his family since his wife was expecting kid number 4 and my place was nearer to his work. He even suggested I could live in the camper while they take over the main house, without ever mentioning rent, even though he has a decent job. He went on about how there'd be changes, like curfews, and I couldn't just walk in without notice. If it wasn't Dan, I'd think he was out of his mind, but our parents have always treated him like he's the golden child. I tried to get a word in, but he kept steamrolling over me as if my opinion didn't matter. No way was I letting Dan or his messy wife move into my place, especially since I'd heard about stuff like this online and couldn't believe it was happening to me. But my family does kind of fit the bill of being entitled and a bit narcissistic. So I whipped out my phone and started recording. Dan didn't seem to notice, just kept waving his hands around and listing all his reasons for needing my house, acting like it was a done deal. He even tried to shake on it. That's when I stood firm and loudly told him, "No way." It startled him a bit because I've rarely talked to him like that, thanks to our parents' punishments. I declared that my house was off limits, and just because they wanted it didn't mean they'd get it. I reminded him that I bought the house for myself, and it wasn't my fault he kept expanding his family without being able to afford a place of his own. Dan got up close, saying I didn't deserve the house and he needed it more. I just laughed, telling him that was nonsense because I worked hard to buy my home. Dan yelled back about me being single and child-free, so I should just give him the space. I shot down that idea, pointing out he didn't even offer to pay rent. I'd still be forking out for the mortgage while living in a camper outside. Then Dan said he shouldn't have to pay because family comes first and our parents supposedly said I'd do this. Right on cue, my parents and sister-in-law barged back in, trying to corner me into agreeing. Chaos ensued. I heard "just do it for Dan" more times than I could count. I told them to butt out of my life and leave or I'd call the cops. My sister-in-law screamed the loudest, being pregnant and all, and I told her I didn't owe her anything. She assumed she could just take advantage of me. After calling her a stuck-up, well, I told her I have no sympathy for her. That's when she snapped and took a swing at me, aiming to do more damage before Dan held her back. She kept yelling at him to let her go so she could tear into me, but my phone was... So basically, I was recording everything on my phone and I held it up and said I was calling the cops if they didn't leave right then. My parents said to Dan they were leaving, but my mom threw in some drama, saying I had a week to come to my senses. I told her nah, not happening and not to come back. Then, I warned my sister-in-law that my phone caught everything and if she acted up I'd press charges for assault. She screamed and ran out crying. My mom, being the last one to leave, told me I should do this for Dan and Sil. I just told her, nope. So, update time. Like I mentioned before, many might find this hard to believe, and yeah, I'm aware there are similar tales online, but Hey, just because others have posted similar stuff doesn't mean they own the rights to these kinds of horror stories. I'm kind of surprised this site isn't more effectively used against entitled people because folks like them should be scared of being called out. I don't blame anyone who reads this and is skeptical. I would be too. But after reading my earlier post, you'll see just how twisted my parents are. They've seriously spoiled my brother, Dan, without ever giving me a solid reason why. And I'm worried maybe there just isn't one. Some folks just can't explain why they play favorites with their kids. It's like all they can do is stand by the kid they've been backing, which is exactly what my folks tried doing, and I've pretty much wrecked their lives emotionally for it. After I kicked out my parents, my brother, and Sil for trying to strong-arm me into giving my brother my new house, I hopped on social media and spilled the tea to the whole family. Word spread fast, but you won't find it anymore because it's all been deleted, and I locked down my profile. I shared it all because I knew the family would try to twist it and paint me as the bad guy, which is exactly what they did. But I had about an hour head start, plus video evidence to back me up. No, I don't plan on showing the video here, so don't even ask. Acting fast helped me get a lot of family members on my side right away. My parents, Dan, and Essel probably wanted to post their own version, but it was too late. They didn't even try to lie much. They had a few supporters, but nothing major. Most of the family already knew how entitled they were, so they quickly understood and accepted what went down. There was one person who called me, I have no idea who they were, ranted at me about being a terrible brother and needing to step aside for, and I quote, a real family man. I just hung up and blocked them. That was the end of that. A week later, as promised in their ultimatum, my parents showed up with Dan on my doorstep. They started ringing the bell and pounding the door like crazy until I opened it just a crack. They tried to shove their way in again, but I'd already installed some latch chains and was bracing the door. My dad and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything and would call the police if they tried again. My mom calmed them down and sickly sweet asked if I was ready to let my bro move in. I told them all to buzz off and don't come back. My mom put on some fake tears, pleading about how I should just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and said I didn't love him as a brother because he'd treated me like garbage for years and they'd encouraged it. They were terrible parents, and he was a terrible brother. So I told them to leave or I'd call the cops right away. Surprisingly, they left easily, apart from my mom's loud crying and some dirty looks. It was almost too easy. I thought I was done, but oh boy, should have taken them more seriously. Later that week on Friday evening, I came home to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan in my driveway. They were moving stuff in. Dan just waved at me with this smug grin. I was furious and told them to stop. Sil smugly said that like it or not they were moving in, and in this super fake way, with head tilting and lip puckering, she told me it was fine because Mommy said so, and I should listen to Mommy. Just hearing her say that made my blood boil, so I locked myself in my truck and called the cops. When they saw what I was doing, Sil started pounding on my window, yelling at me to stop, saying they needed the house, all while crying about why I couldn't just do this for Dan. I shot back that it was my house, not his. Then she threatened to key my truck unless I quit calling the cops, which the 911 operator totally heard through my slightly open window. I warned her if she damaged my truck, I'd sue. She backed off when the cops showed up. Dan and Sil, with their kids, had locked themselves inside my house. I showed the cops my updated driver's license with my address on it and told them what was going down. We got to my front door, and I saw they'd changed the lock and tossed the old one, drilled out onto the porch with the drill and a full drill bit set right next to it. Could they be any more obvious leaving evidence like that? I showed the police the broken lock and gave them the full scoop of everything that went down. I guess Dan must have called our parents because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. They immediately started lying, saying I'd agreed to rent the place to Dan and his family. I told them that's an easy lie to debunk. Dan and Sil swaggered out of the house with some papers, looking super smug, thinking they'd outsmarted me. They showed fake rental agreements, but my signature wasn't on them. There was one, but it was nothing like my handwriting. Guessing they've never actually seen my real signature. Super dumb move. I told my parents and Dan that was blatant fraud, and if investigated, it'd be obvious. I said jail wouldn't help them, and it could cost Dan his job, his only means to provide for his family. I also warned I'd sue for any lost, stolen, or damaged stuff and even call CPS if needed. Dan went pale, looking scared, but my mom stepped in, insisting I should just give Dan the house and move into a camper so they could have a family home. I shouted back that if it was such a great idea, she could let Dan have her house instead. The cops separated us and I said I wanted them gone immediately or I'd press charges. I yelled about how they drilled out my lock to break in, forged my signature, and how I have video of Sil attacking me, all felonies. I had the power to wreck their lives with this if I wanted, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. I'm not sure if I missed a chance with the dance kids, but once my parents realized they couldn't force me to do it, things changed. My mom gave in, saying she'd stop this whole charade. She chatted quietly with S while my dad talked to Dan. Suddenly, Sil burst into tears and dramatically shredded the fake rental papers, throwing them around like confetti. An officer, not amused, told them to clean it up or face a littering fine. By then, both cops had that, "I don't get paid enough for this" look. Dan told his kids to unload the moving truck, and they all started crying. The oldest was heartbroken about losing his own room. Sil and Dan tried one last guilt trip, putting on this rehearsed sad family act. Sil rubbed her pregnant belly, playing the sad puppy. Dan begged, "Please, we need this home," but I stood firm and told them to keep packing. All the kids and Sil ramped up the crying, and Dan yelled, "Are you happy now? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish." I just laughed and told him this wasn't sharing, it was taking. I said he wasn't my brother anymore, just a selfish jerk. Dan exploded with curses until the cops told him to chill or face arrest. He reluctantly handed over the house keys but threw them into a storm drain first. A cop made him retrieve them, which he did while getting filthy. Eventually, he slammed them into my hand. I told them to leave and never return. My mom threatened to disown me, as if that was a big deal. I sarcastically remarked about missing out on family holidays where I was always the black sheep. They treated me so poorly growing up that I'd never help Dan, even if he needed an organ donor. I told them to keep packing, and my mom tried to bargain, saying Dan could pay rent or I could move back in with them. I shut that down, saying deals with them were like making deals with the devil. Sil threw a tantrum in my yard because she didn't want to move back in with my parents. Eventually, they packed everything back into the truck. I took the opportunity to confront my parents about all the crap they put me through. The cops watched intently, making my parents squirm. I called them out on how they let Dan and Sil ridicule me and how they deserted me when I needed help. It felt good to put them on the spot. My father looked like he wanted to punch me but restrained himself. Dan gathered his stuff and left without a word, while Sil sulked. Once they were gone, I checked that nothing was stolen. Thankfully, I didn't have much furniture back then. As they drove away, I vowed never to ask anything from them again because I'd always be just a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I went back inside, feeling a mix of relief and determination to move forward on my own terms. So, the truth came out about what went down, and my parents were way too embarrassed to even try defending themselves this time. Our family, which was kinda split before, totally swung to my side after this whole mess. Almost everyone has backed me now, except a few who are just staying neutral, no matter how much my parents used to spin the "we did it for Dan" story. Now, they've pretty much lost any support they had left. Even some folks I thought would never side with me, like the former Flying Monkeys, finally decided they'd had enough. Around that time, I offered to host a Christmas Eve get-together at my new place for half the family, but my parents didn't make the guest list. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on my brother's and sister-in-law's profiles, and I saw that SIL had her fourth kid in early November. They're still bunked up with my folks, and I'm pretty sure they saw I was lurking. SIL kept posting these passive-aggressive notes about not having enough space while living with my parents. I think it's just to see if she can guilt-trip me. I'm sure my parents are losing it with all that chaos from 3 rambunctious kids. A mentally unstable SIL, my golden child brother, and a newborn all crammed in their house. Maybe they should just pack up and move into a camper in their backyard and let Dan take over. That might actually give them some peace. I planned on updating everyone with a part 3 because this story got way too long. As for those who suggested getting cameras, I will when I can afford them. Right now, I'm still recovering from buying my house last year, and decent cameras need a good computer to record too. All I've got is an old laptop running Windows 10, but I'm definitely looking into doorbell cams first. For those who said I should have gotten my brother and Sil arrested, I didn't because their kids need them. If Dan gets arrested, he'd probably lose his job, which would leave his family with no income, especially with Sael having a newborn right now. But hey, revenge doesn't always need jail time. I got my payback without filing a police report, but I wouldn't be this nice again. They know it. I decided to wait until after New Year's to post more, just in case something else happened. And guess what? It did. My Sael kept up her passive-aggressive social media posts, mostly aimed at me, about how cramped they are living with my parents and blah blah blah. I know I sound dismissive, but after everything I've been through with these people, you'd understand the sarcasm. So I invited half the family over for Christmas Eve, and they all came, even though it was a 3 to 4 hour drive. They wanted to support me and were super nice about my new house. Some relatives even brought CDs with awesome Christmas music, and my favorite was the one my uncle brought, Ray Charles singing Christmas songs. It was the best party I'd had in years, and I finally felt like I could just let go of all the drama for once. But of course, you know who showed up. My parents, brother, and Sil just walked in without knocking, acting like they were invited. I turned off the music and told them to leave, while an uncle backed me up, saying they didn't deserve to be there after the stunts they pulled. Even my grandparents chimed in, telling my parents it was way too soon to make amends and expressing their disappointment. They told Dan and Sil they were fed up with the nonsense posts and said my house wasn't going to be their new home. Sil pulled her usual stunt, whining that it wasn't fair I got this house alone while she, with 4 kids, needed more space. I couldn't help but point out that she wasn't exactly Mother of the Year since my mom did most of the childcare while she just lounged around. I might have taken it too far when I joked about how much she drinks, and she demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I just said, "You do the math," and told her to use her college degree, get a job, and save up if she ever wanted to move out. Things got intense when my brother's 7-year-old started yelling at me, saying I was the bad guy for not letting them live with me. My brother tried to pull him away, but this turned into a family intervention against them. Sil and her kids were crying, and even Dan was nearly in tears from the whole confrontation. He just sat there, looking defeated, not daring to say a word with everyone ready to call him out. Wow, so here's the scoop. This guy, we'll call him Golden Child, tried to boss me around a while back, even trying to snatch my house. But guess what? He got humiliated big time, and both his and my folks' reputations took a nosedive in the family. After all the drama, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law, Esil, left with their tails between their legs, and we got the party back on track without mentioning the chaos. Since everyone had enjoyed a few drinks, they all crashed at my place, and I even let some hang out in my camper, which made for a decent guest house. They all wanted a tour, and couldn't believe I'd lived there for about 2 years, bombarding me with questions about what it was like through the seasons. On Christmas morning, I was up first, armed with coffee and ibuprofen for those eggnog hangovers. Turns out, I was a more gracious host than my parents ever were, and we all decided to make this a yearly tradition. After Christmas, Sil stopped posting her snide comments on social media, though she did try to stir the pot a bit later with a post about convincing my parents to get a camper for Dan and his family. Unsurprisingly, my parents were not on board with that idea, and the post vanished a couple of days later. As for me, things calmed down, and I even had a poker night with friends where we devoured Burger King Whoppers and drank to our heart's content, despite me being clueless at poker. I'm thinking about maybe looking for a date come summer because I'm not getting any younger. Meanwhile, my old camper is just chilling in the yard, my little retreat, and maybe one day I'll actually go camping for real, something my parents thought was a waste of time. Since then, my family's been giving me the silent treatment, which is perfectly okay with me. But I'm sure they'll make a comeback at some point with some crazy idea. If they do, I might just update everyone. Recently, my parents did reach out wanting to meet up in public, and it felt like a setup. But I wasn't worried. I was curious. We met at a place that sounds like Olive Garden, and they asked me to help Dan get an apartment, either with money or by co-signing. I flat out refused, pointing out that I'm still rebuilding my finances after buying my house, and Dan's salary is actually better than mine. When I broke down my expenses, they seemed shocked. I'm carefully saving for any emergencies that might pop up, like fixing my beat-up truck or dealing with unexpected bills. I'm not an ATM, and I made it clear. My dad, usually quick to anger, just looked defeated and maybe a bit regretful. It's like they realized they can't push me around anymore, and I'm kind of enjoying watching them face the music. So, when it came time to fork over any cash, Dan just straight up stood up and said this whole thing was a waste and he was out of there. My mom started saying sorry on his behalf, but Dan was still set on leaving. Just to lighten the mood, I said I'd buy everyone a round of endless soup and salad. I mean, who says no to free food, right? Since we hadn't ordered anything besides drinks, they stayed. I made sure to chat about anything but money. Dan just kept quiet, either munching on his food or glued to his phone. My folks awkwardly tried to chit-chat, eventually telling me they'd joined a local Christian church and had been going for a couple of weeks. I casually said, "Good for you." And of course, they tried to invite me along. I just said, "No thanks." And they got the hint not to push it. After we wrapped up the meal, Dan left a $10 tip on the table and took off without a word to anyone. My mom made excuses for him, and we all went our separate ways. Not as much drama as I expected, but still way better than how things used to be with my family. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law, Sael, has been venting online about my parents, mostly upset that she's not the queen bee of their household anymore. I think her toxic attitude is starting to get to them. Why else would they crawl back to me for help? Sael even suggested my parents should move into a camper to make room at their place, but they've shot down that idea every time. She's got this little group of like-minded car enthusiasts who occasionally message me, griping that I won't give up my house for her. I don't bother responding to these folks anymore. I just block and move on. There was one persistent caller who kept bugging me, saying I needed to hand over my place to a real family man like Dan, but I didn't care. The calls have died down since I made it clear they were only making me laugh. Fast forward a few months, and things haven't gone south for me, but my parents and Dan hit a rough patch. I installed some cameras around the house, including a Ring doorbell just in case, but nobody's tried breaking in. I'm renting out 2 rooms in my house, one to a friend and the other to his buddy. They're awesome tenants, super quiet, and even have their own mini fridges so they don't use the main fridge. The rent deal I offered was too sweet to pass up, and it's helping me save a nice chunk of change, covering a good part of my mortgage. Of course, when my parents found out I was renting the rooms, they weren't thrilled. SIL actually freaked, which led to my mom coming over in tears, asking why I rented the rooms to friends instead of Dan and his crew. We had a little spat. I mean, they did try to swipe my house once. Plus, there's just no room for Dan, Sil, and their 4 kids in my 3-bedroom home. My tenants prefer their own space, and I don't want to live with people who mocked me when I was struggling. Eventually, my mom backed down, admitting she was just desperate. Turns out, Sil's been sneakily following me somehow, told my parents about the rentals, and then my mom came to cry about it. But since then, they haven't bothered me about the house, so things are looking up for me, not so much for my parents and Dan. It turns out Sil was worse than I thought. She had an affair, and the youngest kid isn't even Dan's. The divorce went in Dan's favor, and he managed to get his name off the birth certificate for the youngest. SIL blamed me for everything, like I was sitting on a gold mine or something. She pushed for the whole family to cozy up to me during Christmas, hoping to score some cash, but that backfired big time. Her plan to crash my party and grab whatever gifts they could find was a total flop. Everyone at the party was behind me when I kicked them out, which kind of woke my parents up to not listen to Sil anymore. They started going back to church, and even came to apologize to me after they saw a video of my story. Turns out they've known about my Reddit account for a while now. So, I've shared all this stuff, and yeah, my parents and Dan aren't thrilled, but everyone here deserves to know what's up, since it's all anonymous for them. Watching an animated video of their own actions helped my parents and Dan see what kind of people they really are, and they actually came over to apologize to me later. I've never seen my dad apologize like that before. He's terrible at faking it, so I know it was real. They totally owned up to what they did to me, saying there was no excuse, and even admitted they were narcissists. They really did a number on me, but they did put a lot of the blame on Sil, and honestly, she was guilty of plenty. My parents have been in counseling for a while and offered family sessions, but I'm not ready for that right now. Dan didn't say sorry for a long time, but he looked like he felt bad every time the past came up. Meanwhile, his marriage to Sil completely crashed and burned. Without me as the scapegoat or ATM, they couldn't mock or squeeze for cash anymore, and after being embarrassed on social media with my Reddit posts and that animated video, Sil finally showed enough of her true colors for Dan and my parents to see what she was really like. She was in denial, but her entitlement was on another level. I've imagined lightsabers clashing over this whole drama, with Sil as a wannabe Sith, but never delved into the details. Things hit the fan when Dan called Sil out for cheating. We were all shocked because we thought he was just under her thumb, but nope. He wasn't putting up with her lies anymore. You know how he treated me when I was on his bad side? Well, he was just as tough on her. He started piecing together her deceit and secretly got DNA tests on all their kids. Turns out the baby wasn't his. Dan laid out all the evidence, texts, phone records, and the DNA test, right in front of her and our parents. Sil tried every trick in the book to deny it, but Dan wasn't buying it. He even figured out who the other guy was. Of course, Sil lost it when my parents kicked her out. She went nuts and started getting physical, so my mom had to call the cops. Sil ended up getting arrested after scratching Dan and Dad and, unfortunately, hitting her oldest kid during the chaos. Dan had been smart enough to record their confrontation on his phone, so the police had everything they needed. Sil's parents bailed her out and collected her stuff shortly after. A few days later, Sil showed up at my place, fuming and accusing me of being the reason for her downfall. She was ranting about how I should have given up my house for her family. She tried to push me around, but I wasn't having any of it. I told her the cops would be called and that my doorbell camera recorded everything. That freaked her out, and after I laid into her about her entitlement and all the terrible things she'd done, she took off. I finally went to the police and reported her for harassment and the previous assault, and I even got a restraining order. That seemed to shut her down for now, as she's gone quiet on social media. The blame game against me sailed ages ago, but either way, she's left me alone now. Sil was still with her partner during the divorce, and back then, I didn't really know what kind of guy he was. But honestly, anyone who messes with someone else's spouse and even has a kid with them doesn't exactly have high moral standards. Once the divorce started, Sil admitted that Dan just wasn't cutting it for her anymore because he couldn't give her the lifestyle she wanted. She believed she was on par with a trophy wife and deserved someone wealthy. Dan told Amy and just laughed it off, saying she wasn't even close to hot enough to be a trophy wife and pointed out all her flaws. Sil ended up super embarrassed and ran back to her parents because Dan wasn't giving her access to his bank accounts anymore. She'd maxed out all the credit cards he once gave her and complained about working for her parents, despite having a college degree. But honestly, they were probably her only option with a criminal record and a decade-long resume gap. I heard from Dan that her parents were really disappointed in her too, but that's just a rumor. They might be just as bad for all I know. Either way, the divorce drama really kicked off once it got started. Sil didn't walk away with much, especially because she'd had an affair and physically hurt her husband and eldest kid, and it's an at-fault state, as I mentioned before. So she pretty much kissed any chance of getting money goodbye. I'll dive into that in more detail in my final update. Part 6. This is what I know from my brother Dan. His lawyer worked some magic to get the divorce rolling quickly, but it cost him. I don't have all the nitty-gritty details or know how much it cost since they never told me. Sil, on the other hand, was cornered financially and, well, you know what happens when you corner an animal. They fight back. But the law and her dwindling finances weren't on her side. Her parents had to get her a lawyer, but he wasn't a great one. And Sil actually brought her affair partner to court to testify for her. This guy was a smooth talker with a winning smile, claiming that Sil had been let down by Dan, which is why she sought someone else. He even said he was ready to step up for the kid he had with Sil, but that she'd still need alimony to support herself and the child. He argued that because Dan was still on the birth certificate, alimony should be Dan's responsibility. Dan said this guy used big words and a charming smile but was a special kind of stupid, and coming from Dan, that says a lot. The judge wasn't swayed at all and basically called out this guy for being a hypocrite. He shut up real quick after that. Dan considered suing him for alienation of affection, but that didn't pan out. Proving Sil loved Dan before the affair wasn't going to be easy, especially after we saw her true colors. Some people think Sil kept having kids just to avoid getting a job, and they might be right. Either way, Sil tried dragging out the divorce, but Dan's lawyer and the judge didn't let that happen much. I think Dan really lucked out because he got one of the toughest judges when it comes to cheaters, and all the evidence we had on Sil made it easy to keep her from playing the victim. So instead, she just showed her true self since there was no point hiding anymore. The court had all our records, police reports, photos, and recordings, to prove she was abusive and narcissistic. It was a mountain of evidence against her that she had no way of overcoming. She tried to fight it, but it was like trying to stand against an avalanche. In the end, Sil made a deal to wrap things up quickly. Dan took on 3/4 of the credit card debt, got his name off the affair baby's birth certificate, and Sil ended up with partial custody of her kids, no alimony, and was stuck with her share of the credit debt. With her being employed by her parents, she had an income to start paying off her debts. She can see her kids pretty much whenever she wants and can have them on weekends, but for some reason hasn't really tried to see them much. She's taken them out for fast food a few times, but never brought them back home. Now the kids are back in school, so she has fewer chances to see them. You'd think her parents would want to see their grandkids, but they haven't reached out to Dan about it. They barely saw Dan's kids before, so they might not bother now. Maybe they just don't like kids. Even Dan doesn't know, but he says his in-laws were always indifferent to him. As for Dan, he really did love his wife, so her betrayal hit him hard, and he turned to alcohol. The night he confronted her, he showed up at my place with a bottle of whiskey, all scratched up and bandaged. He wasn't drunk yet, but seeing him like that freaked me out. I gave him a hard time for driving under the influence, but that didn't mean much compared to the betrayal he felt. We spent a few hours hanging out in my camper so we wouldn't bother my tenants. Dan was drinking straight from the bottle and crying about how foolish he felt and how he regretted marrying Sil. Now he just calls her that, and that's her new nickname. Ironically, this was the most bonding Dan and I had done in 15 years. He didn't apologize exactly, but he called himself a crappy person with terrible taste in women and said I at least didn't make his mistakes. Despite everything, he's still my younger brother, and I couldn't let him drive home. I told him to stay over and took his keys, setting up the camper's bunk for him since I rented out my spare rooms. He wasn't fit to drive, and if he took an Uber, he'd just have to return for his car. Plus, he didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that, and I was worried he might do something stupid if I let him go. I didn't want him sleeping in the house, so the camper was the best option. It didn't mean I suddenly trusted him. We spent time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Poker wasn't fun with just 2 people, and Old Maid was boring, but thankfully, I had an Uno deck and an old-school battleship game that he really got into. It was enough to keep him busy until he was ready to crash after running out of whiskey. He threw up a lot of it in a bucket anyway, but didn't mind sleeping in my camper. In fact, he thought it was kinda cool. Dan had a ton of questions about how I lived in the camper for so long, and I answered them all just to keep him engaged. But I needed to get some sleep myself since I had to be up early, so I left him with my portable DVD player and called it a night. So, I left a couple of movies for Dan so he could chill by himself for a bit. Assuming he didn't crash out first, I also swung by the camper early in the morning before heading to work, while Dan was still out cold in the bunk. I left a bottle of ibuprofen, an energy drink, his car keys, and a note saying he could leave through the backyard gate. He managed to see himself out without any issues around 1:30 p.m., about a month after his ex, who we call Exil, got kicked out. Dan came up to me asking to borrow my camper. Seems he found it cozier than I thought when he crashed there and finally admitted he didn't ask sooner because of his pride. With his soon-to-be ex-wife out of the picture, he wanted to give up his room for his eldest kid. Dan has 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the oldest at 8 years old. The kids had been sharing a room until then, with just a curtain for the boy's half, but he often ended up on the couch to avoid his sisters. Poor kid really needed his own space. So Dan decided to do the right thing as a dad and asked if he could borrow my camper so his son could have his own room. If Dan had the cash, he would have gotten his own camper instead of relying on me. He even said so. I hadn't even used the camper for real camping yet, but I gave in and let him use it since it was for a good cause. Plus, he promised to get his own camper eventually. Nope, I didn't ask for any rent for it. Dan's already in a financial hole thanks to Exil and the divorce. I've learned that I get better results with family these days by not being bitter. I parked my camper in my parents' backyard, and my dad set up a 30-amp breaker to power up the heat and AC for Dan when he needed it. Yeah, I miss the camper since living in it felt like it was a part of me. But I loaned it out for Dan's kids. They're pretty much the only reason I deal with my parents or Dan anymore, since I've bonded with them. I know I might not get the camper back in its original condition, but I told Dan and my parents they'll be responsible for any damage or upkeep as long as they have it. I even took tons of pictures and videos of the camper before handing it over. Dan and I recorded a video where he agreed to the terms, so that's basically a contract. Given the divorce mess, Dan probably won't get his own place for a while, but at least he seems happy enough in the camper. Not sure if he genuinely likes it or if he's just putting on a brave face, but I think it reminds him of the backyard forts we built as kids. Anyway, he's living there now. I got major props from the extended family for letting him borrow it, too. They call me the good brother Dan doesn't deserve. Getting rid of Sil was a step in the right direction for our family. I still don't care much for my brother or parents after how they've treated me. But I won't let Dan's kids suffer for it. They've really warmed up to me and are happy to see me when I'm around or when they visit me. I've even babysat a few times, and now that their mom's out of the picture, they're much nicer. My mom does most of the parenting for my nieces and nephews and tries hard to stay on my good side. My dad looks kinda defeated whenever I'm around, but he's generally nicer now. Not that he talks to me much, but it's a big improvement from before. I'm on my guard, though. My parents seem happier that my ex is gone, and they often wonder what they ever saw in her. My mom, especially, since she and Exil clashed a lot over who was the real mom in the house. Meanwhile, during the divorce, Dan also sued to get his name off the birth certificate of a baby that wasn't his. Exil didn't want to change it since she wanted Dan to keep paying child support. But there was a court-ordered paternity test, and turned out she was lying. Dan's lawyer had a serious chat with Exil's lawyer, and she really didn't have any ground to stand on. She couldn't afford to fight it anymore and agreed to change the birth certificate. The guy who actually knocked her up stepped up financially for the baby, but he didn't stick with her either. He reached out to Dan through his lawyer to say he was out of the picture and wouldn't be a bother again. Dan sent me a link to the guy's social media, and I checked it out. Looks like he's not thrilled about being a dad and feels too young for it, which is ironic since he's over 40. He made his profile private soon after, and Exil had already done the same, so I guess that's the end of that saga. Exil's out of our hair. My parents and Dan are trying to be better people, and surprisingly, I'm enjoying being an uncle. My house is still my own, and the drama seems to be dying down. Exil must have seen my Reddit posts because she complained to Dan about them, saying I should delete my account. But Dan's read the post too and doesn't care. In fact, he thinks they remind him of how much he's changed for the better, so he's not losing any sleep over it. My parents are trying to treat Dan and me more equally now, which is a nice change. My dad is still pretty quiet around me, but someone pointed out that it's probably because he doesn't know how to connect with me after all those years of treating me differently. My mom says sorry for everything now, feeling like she owes me for past behavior. Dan mentioned that they've been getting a lot of flack from the extended family and their counselor. It's a huge difference from how they used to act. Funny thing, I didn't mention what Exil thought about Dan borrowing the camper for his son. She mocked him for living like a bum, but Dan just let it roll off his back. He expected her to act that way and doesn't care anymore. She's pretty much dead to him. He pointed out to her that he was putting his kids first so his son could have his own room, something his ex never did. She only ever used the kids to keep from working and manipulate everyone. This was all during the early days of their divorce, so you can imagine her tantrum about my posts. No one's bothered to reach out to me on her behalf to take them down, so she just has to live with the shame, which she totally deserves. She's been trying to be nicer to Dan lately, probably because she realizes living with her parents isn't as great as she thought. Dan